HFY Reddit stories, the human who emerged from the dungeon. The room was dim, lit only by faintly glowing crystals embedded in the stone walls. A lone figure leaned heavily on a makeshift staff, his breath ragged and uneven, his clothes were torn and blood-stained, a patchwork of fabric that had been mended far too many times, yet his eyes burned with an intensity that seemed to defy the oppressive darkness around him. He was a human, a species thought extinct in this part of the world for centuries, and he had just clawed his way out of a dungeon no one had ever escaped. The dungeon, known as the Maw, was infamous throughout the multiverse. It wasn't just a labyrinth of traps and monsters, it was alive, a sentient entity that fed on the despair of its captives. Many had entered, lured by promises of unparalleled treasure or ultimate power, but none had returned. Over the years, it had become a legend, a whispered tale told by adventurers over campfires. But now, someone had emerged. The first to spot him was a caravan of elves traveling the trade route that passed near the Maw's entrance. They stopped dead in their tracks when the figure stumbled out of the forest. His movements were halting, as though each step was a battle against unseen chains. "What is that?" one elf whispered, her voice trembling. "It's impossible," another replied. "No one leaves the Maw." The human collapsed before they could question him, his body hitting the ground with a thud. For a moment, they hesitated, unsure whether to approach, but curiosity and the faint sense of pity won out. They carried him to their wagon, where they nursed him back to health. When he awoke, the human introduced himself as Daniel Ward, a name that meant nothing to the elves but carried the weight of 1,000 battles to him. He spoke little of what had happened inside the dungeon, only revealing snippets that made their blood run cold. "I was taken," he said simply, "not by choice. I don't even know how long I was in there." He described horrors they could scarcely imagine, monsters that defied natural laws, puzzles that tested not just logic but morality, forcing him to make choices that haunted him still. Worst of all was the Maw itself, whispering to him in the dark, trying to break him. "I wasn't the first," Daniel admitted. "There were others, from different worlds, different times. Most of them didn't make it." "How did you survive?" one elf asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's eyes darkened. "Because I'm human." Word of Daniel's escape spread like wildfire, reaching the ears of kings and warlords, scholars and mages. Some sought him out to learn the secrets of the Maw, hoping to exploit its power. Others feared him, seeing him as a harbinger of chaos, but all were fascinated by the same question: how had a mere human accomplished what no one else could? The answer lay in humanity's greatest strength, a strength often underestimated in the multiverse. Adaptability, resilience, the stubborn refusal to give up. Inside the Maw, Daniel had faced challenges designed to exploit his weaknesses, but he had turned those weaknesses into strengths. He had failed, yes, countless times, but each failure taught him something new, each defeat made him stronger. And when the Maw whispered promises of power, he resisted. When it tried to break his spirit, he fought back with defiance and humor. "I told it a knock-knock joke once," Daniel said with a smirk when pressed by a bard for details. "Pretty sure that's what finally made it give up on me." But Daniel's story didn't end with his escape. The Maw wasn't finished with him. It had marked him in ways he didn't yet understand. Shadows seemed to cling to him, and nightmares followed him even in the daylight. Yet, he refused to hide. Instead, he became a symbol of hope for those oppressed by forces greater than themselves. His journey inspired others, humans and non-humans alike, to stand up against impossible odds. "Humanity isn't just about surviving," Daniel told a crowd one evening, his voice carrying across the campfire. "It's about thriving, about building something better, even when the whole world is against you." And so, the legend of the human who emerged from the dungeon grew. Tales of his courage spread across the multiverse, whispered in taverns and sung by minstrels. But Daniel didn't care for fame or glory. He had one goal: to make sure no one else would suffer as he had. Because the Maw wasn't just a dungeon, it was a test, and Daniel was determined to ensure humanity passed it, no matter the cost. The human who emerged from the dungeon wasn't just a survivor. He was a conqueror. A builder. A beacon of hope. Part 2, The Maw's Shadow. Daniel Ward's escape from the Maw was only the beginning. The dungeon, though vanquished for now, had left its mark, not just on him but on the world itself. The first sign came 2 weeks after Daniel's emergence. He was staying in a bustling elven trade city, trying to piece together the fragments of his old life. He hadn't found a way back to Earth, or even been sure it still existed. For now, he accepted the kindness of strangers while he planned his next move. But then the dreams started. At first, they were merely unsettling, a replay of his time in the moor, distorted and fragmented. Then they grew darker, more vivid. He saw places he'd never been, lands far from the trade city, consumed by an eerie black mist. He saw people trapped, their faces twisted in terror as shadows dragged them into the abyss. It wasn't until he woke one night, his room filled with faint whispers, that he understood. The moor was calling. Daniel wasn't the only one who felt it. Across the multiverse, strange phenomena began to occur. Dungeon entrances that had been dormant for centuries flared to life, spewing forth hordes of monstrous creatures. Villages vanished overnight, swallowed by creeping darkness. Adventurers who delved into these new dungeons never returned, or worse, they returned changed, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light and their minds consumed by madness. Scholars and mages struggled to find answers, poring over ancient tomes and divining the stars, but one name kept surfacing in their research: the moor. It wasn't just a dungeon, it was a seed, a fragment of something far greater and far older, and now, with Daniel's escape, it had awakened. Daniel couldn't ignore it, though he longed for peace. The weight of responsibility bore down on him. He had survived the moor, but he hadn't defeated it, and now, its corruption was spreading. "What do you expect me to do?" he asked the elven scholar Alenia, one of the few who believed in him. "You're the only one who's faced it and lived," she replied. "If anyone can stop it, it's you." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Yeah, but I barely made it out alive. I don't have magic, I don't have a weapon of legend, I'm just me." "That's exactly why you must try," Alenia said. "The moor underestimates you, just as it did before." Reluctantly, Daniel agreed. He set out with a small group of companions. Alenia, the elven scholar, whose knowledge of ancient magic and dungeons rivaled that of any archmage; Thren, a grizzled orc mercenary who owed Daniel a life debt after a chance encounter saved his family; Kara, a half-dwarven engineer with a knack for creating gadgets and explosives out of scrap; Sithra, a tiefling rogue who claimed she joined for the thrill but seemed to have her own reasons for following Daniel. Together, they traveled to the first site of corruption, a human city on the edge of the eastern wastes. When they arrived, the city was unrecognizable. The streets were choked with black vines that pulsed like veins, and the air was thick with an acrid stench. The citizens wandered aimlessly, their eyes hollow and their skin pale. At the heart of the city stood a massive black spire that hadn't been there before. Its surface writhed as though alive, and faint whispers emanated from it, tugging at the edges of the group's minds. "This is worse than I thought," Alenia muttered, clutching her staff tightly. "It's like the moor threw up on this place," Kara said, her voice trying to mask her unease. Daniel stepped forward, gripping the hilt of a rusty sword he had picked up along the way. "Let's not wait around to find out what it's planning. We go in, we cut it out at the root." The others exchanged uneasy glances but followed him into the spire. Inside, the spire was a twisted mirror of the moor's depths. The walls were lined with shifting shadows, and the air hummed with a low, oppressive tone. Puzzles barred their path, ones that required not just wit but the courage to confront personal fears. At one point, Thren was forced to relive the moment he failed to save his comrades in a past battle. Kara faced a memory of abandonment, her father's disapproving voice echoing in her ears. Even Alenia faltered, haunted by visions of a forbidden experiment she had conducted in her youth. Daniel, too, was tested. The moor whispered to him again, offering him freedom, power, even a chance to return home, but he had heard its lies before. He gritted his teeth and pressed on, pulling his companions with him when they faltered. At the spire's core, they found the source of the corruption, a fragment of the moor itself, pulsating with dark energy. It lashed out at them, summoning grotesque creatures and warping reality around them. The battle was brutal. Kara's gadgets exploded in bursts of fire and light, holding back the creatures while Sithra darted through the chaos, striking with precision. Thren fought like a whirlwind, his axe cleaving through the corrupted abominations. Alenia chanted incantations, her magic shielding the group and searing the fragment with radiant energy. But it was Daniel who struck the final blow. Charging through the fray, he drove his sword, an ordinary blade, but wielded with extraordinary will, into the fragment. The explosion of light and sound was deafening, and when the dust settled, the spire was gone. The city was saved. But Daniel knew this was only the beginning. The Moor's corruption was spreading across the multiverse, and each fragment would need to be destroyed. As he stood in the ruins of the spire, his companions gathering around him, he felt the weight of the journey ahead, but he also felt something else, hope. "We stopped it here," he said, his voice steady. "We can stop it everywhere." And so, the human who emerged from the dungeon became something more. He became a hunter of shadows, a destroyer of darkness, and the multiverse's greatest hope against the Moor. Part 3, The Rising Tide. The victory in the eastern wastes was short-lived. Word spread of Daniel and his companions, but so did the whispers of the Moor's vengeance. Cities on distant worlds reported similar spires emerging, some more sinister and well-defended than the one they had just destroyed. The corruption was spreading faster than anyone anticipated. Daniel and his team pressed on, their resolve tested with each step, but for every spire they destroyed, another seemed to rise. The Moor was learning, adapting, just as Daniel had once done inside its depths. The Council of Realms. As the crisis grew, the multiverse's most powerful factions convened a rare summit, the Council of Realms. This gathering, held in the ethereal city of Solentari, brought together the greatest minds, leaders, and warriors from countless worlds. High elves stood beside dwarven kings, dragonborn mages debated celestial beings, and even shadowy representatives of the tiefling syndicates whispered in the corners. Daniel's arrival caused an uproar. "Why is he here?" boomed a Minotaur chieftain, his horns glinting under the chamber's enchanted lights. "This human meddler woke the Moor. Why should we trust him?" Daniel stood, unarmed and unarmored, but his presence filled the room. "I didn't ask for this," he said, his voice calm but firm, "but I survived the Moor when no one else did, and I've fought its fragments since. If you think blaming me will stop it, go ahead, but if you want to fight, then stand with me." The chamber fell silent. A slender celestial stepped forward, her voice ringing like chimes. "You claim to know the Moor. What is it, truly? Can it even be destroyed?" Daniel hesitated, the weight of the answer heavy on his shoulders. "The Moor isn't just a dungeon or a fragment, it's alive, it's hungry, and it's growing stronger every time we fail to stop it." "And its weakness?" the Celestial pressed. He looked around the room, meeting their skeptical gazes. "Its weakness is us, when we work together, when we refuse to break. That's what I learned inside. The Moor thrives on fear and despair, but it can't handle defiance." For a moment, no one spoke, then Elenia stepped forward. "He's right. If the Moor could be defeated by power alone, it would have been destroyed ages ago. We need every realm, every race, every resource, or none of us will survive." Reluctantly, the council agreed. Alliances were formed, and resources pooled, but the task ahead seemed insurmountable. The Hunter and the Moor. The fight against the Moor's corruption transformed Daniel and his companions into legends. They became known as the Moor Hunters, a name whispered with both hope and dread, but with each battle, the stakes grew higher. The spires became more fortified, guarded by creatures far more intelligent and ruthless. The Moor began targeting Daniel directly, creating illusions and traps designed to break him. It whispered lies about his companions, sowing seeds of doubt. In the shadow of one spire, Sithra turned to him, her expression unusually serious. "Do you ever think we're just delaying the inevitable? What if this thing can't be stopped?" Daniel tightened his grip on his sword. "Then we fight until it's over, because giving up isn't an option." But deep down, even he wondered if they were fighting a losing battle. The Fracture. Their most devastating loss came on a distant desert world. The spire there was larger than any they'd encountered, its corruption stretching across the sands like black rivers. Inside, the puzzles were crueler, the monsters more relentless, the Moor seemed to anticipate their every move. Then came the final chamber. As they approached the core fragment, the walls came alive, closing in around them. A monstrous figure emerged, a towering amalgamation of shadows, metal, and screaming faces. It wasn't just a guardian, it was an avatar of the Moor itself. The battle was chaos. Kara's gadgets misfired, Thren was wounded, and Alenia's magic was drained by the oppressive aura. Sithra darted through the fray, striking at weak points, but even she couldn't evade the creature's grasp forever. Daniel faced the avatar head-on, his sword glowing faintly with energy drawn from his sheer will. "Come on, then," he shouted, "let's finish this." But even he couldn't stand alone. As the avatar loomed over him, a figure stepped in its path. It was Thren. "Get to the core," the orc roared, "I'll hold it off." "No," Daniel shouted, but it was too late. Thren charged the creature, his axe swinging in wide arcs. For a moment, it seemed as though he might succeed, but the avatar struck back with a ferocity that no one could withstand. Thren fell, his body collapsing to the ground as the rest of the group screamed his name. Fueled by grief and rage, they pressed forward. Daniel reached the core and drove his blade into it, shattering the fragment. The spire collapsed, the corruption receding into the void, but the cost was too great. A broken team. Thren's death shattered the group's morale. Kara blamed herself for not building better defenses. Sithra grew colder, her witty remarks replaced with grim silence. Even Alenia, usually the voice of reason, began questioning their mission. But it was Daniel who felt the weight most heavily. He had promised to protect his companions, to lead them through the darkness, and he had failed. Sitting by the campfire one night, Daniel stared into the flames, his expression hollow. "Maybe Sithra's right," he murmured, "maybe we can't win." Alenia placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've faced worse odds before, Thren. Wouldn't want us to give up." Daniel nodded, but the fire in his eyes was dimmer now. The Moor's next move. As the group struggled to regroup, the Moor grew bolder. Entire worlds were consumed, their populations transformed into grotesque extensions of its will. The fragments began to merge, creating superstructures that dwarfed the original spires. But amidst the despair, there were glimmers of hope. The alliances forged at the Council of Realms began to take shape. Armies from across the multiverse marched together, united by a common purpose. New technologies and ancient magics were developed to combat the corruption. And Daniel. He began to change.